Hello and welcome to Unpacking Power, Privilege and Structural Violence, a collaborative podcast series hosted by the University of Cape Town Faculty of Health Sciences Student Societies. Follow with us as we join the ongoing conversations that are being held around the world about dismantling intersecting oppressive systems, and dig into what this means for us in spaces we occupy as Faculty of Health Science students, future health professionals, and members of a complex and unjust social system. This is part one of the three-part podcast series, which will culminate in a live interactive webinar where series speakers will join us to elaborate on the content shared throughout the series and answer some of the questions that have come up. You can post any and all questions on the Google form linked in the description. This is podcast 1, entitled Looking at Racism Through a Public Health Perspective. In this installment, we, as the UCT Surgical Society, together with SHAWCO Health, are bringing you two powerhouse speakers, Dr. Tracey Naledi and Lance Louskieter, to unpack some issues on structural racism and define them in our context in South Africa, to encourage discourse on racism in a healthcare setting, and finally, to promote action and practical ways to oppose this form of systemic violence.
Dr. Naledi is a public health specialist and the Deputy Dean for Health Services in the Faculty of Health Sciences at UCT. She was previously the Chief Director of Health Programs in the Western Cape Department of Health. Dr. Naledi is also a founding chairperson of Takano Atlantic Fellowships for Health Equity in South Africa, one of 7 global programs for leaders addressing economic, social, and structural determinants of health and health inequity. Lance is a PhD student in health policy and systems research at the School of Public Health and Family Medicine at UCT. They are a health systems, intersectional, queer, and decolonial scholar and activist, and advocates for decriminalization of sex work in South Africa. They are also an Atlantic Fellow for Health Equity in South Africa, serves as a board member for the Sexual and Reproductive Justice Coalition, and is a founding member and co-director of Just Choice, a youth sexual and reproductive health and justice education and advocacy organization. Thank you both very much for joining me, and a warm welcome to you. Let's first maybe set a definition of terms so that everyone is on the same page when we discuss this topic. I think it's important to clearly define what race and racism is to our listeners before we start getting into the more serious issues. So I think to start off, can you guys maybe define race and racism and speak a little bit about why it's so difficult for many of us to have these type of conversations?
Thank you, Z, and thank you very much to SHAWCO and the SurgSoc for inviting us and actually having the insight and having so brave to have these very difficult conversations. Really want to commend you on your idea of having these conversations, because it's only through conversation that we learn and we grow. So race is this false idea, and it's important to mention that it is a false idea, that the human species is divided into distinct groups on the basis of inherited physical differences. In fact, the differences that we see in ourselves are as a result of our adaptation to our environment. Researchers have refuted that there is, in fact, an existence of biogenetically distinct races, and now argue that race is a socio-political construct, meaning that it is created by people for a political purpose of giving power to white people and to legitimize the dominance of white people over Black people. And I talk about Black people here in the context of South Africa, as you introduced, Z, that in South Africa, Black means that you are Black African, colored, or Indian. So racism is the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics to distinguish them as inferior or superior to one another on the basis of intellect, of competence, and of moral standards. This actually allows for dehumanization of people by denying them their full humanness and legitimizing cruelty and suffering. So, for example, slavery and other acts of cruelty and violence against Black people is an example of dehumanizing people. So institutional racism is when race causes different level of access to goods, services, and opportunities in society. And apartheid, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is a prime example of that. It's a system of hierarchy and inequity characterized by white supremacy, where there is preferential treatment and privilege and power for white people at the expense of Black people. Ultimately, even though people would like to believe as such, racism is not really about hate. It expresses itself as hate because, remember, I spoke about the issue of dehumanizing being a critical part of racism. It's actually an economic tool, you know. One scholar in explaining this said that if you consider that the slave trade was about taking people from their home and taking them across seas and bringing them to a different land, you would not do that to people you hated. If you hated them, you would just leave them in their continent, in their country, and leave them alone and go back to your home where you don't have any Black people that you hate. In fact, the slave trade was all about profit and free labor. And so this dehumanizing of people justified slavery because they were less competent, less intelligent, had low moral standards, or this is what racism says about Black people. Therefore, it legitimizes people being stolen because they are less than human and taken to other lands for them to be treated as slaves. And in fact, what happened is that the profits that were gained from slavery were so huge that they actually made sure that the system of oppression was strengthened over time. And because there was much to lose, for example, if you gave up slavery. And so some scholars have actually estimated that the free labor from slavery has been estimated to equal to $97 trillion, which has been an investment in economies of the West as a result of slavery. Lance, do you want to comment about the difficulty of talking about race?
Yes, thank you, Tracey, and thank you, colleagues, for this opportunity to engage. I think I agree with Tracey about the importance of conversation and how it facilitates learning. But I also think it's so important for us to understand why race and racism is important to engage on within a context, a university context such as UCT, where politically and historically race has been, or at least white hegemony or Eurocentric hegemony, has been an important kind of a precursor or stance for how the institution is built and founded on. So if you know the history of many institutions within South Africa, the training, whether it is medicine as an institution, the organizational culture of the training of medicine within higher education, these spaces have been influenced by these understandings of kind of structural racism, and also has contributed to this kind of neoliberal economic framing that Tracey has offered us in the explanations of racism. So I do think that, you know, it's a pertinent conversation because right now, today, Black people and the representation of Blackness as a social construction, whether it's Black cultures, Black knowledges, the ways we understand African realities, have implications for how Black people are trained within the institution, but also the ways in which those institutions are responsive to the realities of Black people. And so in a context like South Africa, where medicine and institutions of higher education weren't politically responsible, and in many ways, the gates weren't open for Black people to occupy spaces like these. it is so important to understand the implications thereof, because I always say that these systems weren't designed for Black people. And so anti-Black racism manifests themselves in various ways. And it's only through conversations like these that we can name what the issues are, what the problems are. And so it is important for us to engage also in the ways in which, because we are trained as Black people within these institutions. And so anti-Black racism is also ingrained, or internalized racism at least, is ingrained in our psyches. These practices of Western hegemony influences Black people as well in how they engage with the realities of Black people and the realities of ourselves, that we were trained to delegitimize the knowledges of our ancestors, of our mothers and our fathers, our great-grandfathers, our cultures. We have to do away with those in order to assimilate to Eurocentric cultures and to Western cultures. And we are praised for being able to adapt to spaces like UCT and to be able to adapt to becoming these amazing Western doctors. And we delegitimize the healing practices of indigenous ways of being and doing. And so I think it's so important to name these issues and for all of us, white and Black, to engage with what our political projects are and what work do we need to do to be able to redress these issues in the memories that we, or the histories that we are, the future histories that we are building towards.
And thank you for that, Lance. Just on that, how do you think we should address these historical issues?
I think what's important is for us, as Lance was saying, is to understand the history and where it comes from. And I think in the context of South Africa, we need to understand that when the colonial powers came into South Africa, it was purely just to be like a stop, a refreshment station. When Jan van Riebeeck came here, he was just coming to have a refreshment station. And actually the reason that they stayed here, as I said earlier on, all had economic reason. I mean, they stayed because they needed a sustainable source of meat and vegetables, and they needed more lands to be able to do that. So because they needed that, they then kind of had land seizures from the Khoi and the San people, and in fact legitimized slavery, even though slavery in Britain was abolished in 1833. The slavery here in the Western Cape actually improved, actually was sustained, importing slaves from India and the East. And by the early 1800s, 80% of slaves in the Western Cape were from South Asia, in fact. And when the British took over from the Dutch, they took over the Cape Colony in 1806. Then there was even more expansion into the interior, affecting the rest of South Africa. And the African communities that were living in these lands tried to defend themselves. And you know, the notion of land was very much around communal, and the Khoi and the San people in particular would migrate, and they would use this land for this season and move on to the other ones. And when they come back, they'll find that the colonialists have actually taken off their land, and they actually have just basically taken it. It's like you left it, and so it was yours. And it's important to remember those concepts we're talking about, that it's about, you know, saying that other people's practices and cultures are inferior. So if you don't believe in enclosures of an enclosing lands, then, well, you lose out, you know. So, and not recognizing that other practices and other cultures are legitimate, and they also, you know, they are there for a reason. So the colonialists, when they came here, they started a whole trajectory of events that ultimately resulted in apartheid. And, you know, and all of these actual policies, we were talking about institutional racism earlier on, is about the laws that were put in place to legitimize dispossession of people. You know, for example, the Natives Land Act of 1913, it denied Africans access to land which before they owned, and he actually literally denied them. And what happened, it confined them to reserves, and actually made it so difficult for them to make a living and sustain their livelihood, such that they would actually end up working in the mines when the gold rush came. So, nobody's going to want to work for a small bit of salary, as was happening, for example, in the mines. So what the system did, which is what is important, this was about a system. They created the laws that made it difficult for people to sustain livelihoods and therefore have no other choice to go and, for example, be migrant laborers in the mines. And there's a whole lot of legislative instruments that were put in place to ensure that a kind of the separation of white people and Black people was ensured, and prioritizing and actually legitimizing the privilege of whiteness. And as some researchers have said, that there were, by the kind of end of apartheid, there were 17,000 statutory measures, meaning laws and regulations that were put in place to ensure that there was segregation and control of land division in South Africa, and ended up with like 14 different land control systems in South Africa. And these Bantustans where Black people were largely, their land was taken away from them, and they were given these false perceptions of having independence in the Bantustans, but the Bantustans actually were not economically viable. So that's the history. And it's important for us to understand our history before we can actually move into the future, and understanding that historical context that we have, how then does it express itself in terms of health service provision, etc. So you will understand that because we had, for example, these Bantustans that were there, so what happened when Black people were moved into these Bantustans, they lost the access to South Africa that had all the resources. Already we're talking about land, but it also meant social services as well, health services, etc. And that has actually kind of perpetuated through time to up until today. So if we look at what has happened, for example, economically over the last 100 years, you find that little has changed, even though even now we have these new policies, we have a new government. So in 1920, for example, white person's income per person was 10 times that of Blacks. By 1994, it was 5 times. So it was half, you would think that by now it would be much less, but by 2013, it had gone up actually to 8 times that, because what happened is that post 94, with all the legislation that we put in place, there was an improvement that kind of took us up until 2000. And what happened is that after that, there was a plateauing of improvement in kind of the economic well-being of Black people. And that is because of the sheer number of African people in the population, and these interventions, if you think about them, they are really only affecting a small number of Black people. So even though there have been quite progressive policy instruments to advance the redistribution of resources, etc., it has not been enough, in that by and large, particularly African Black people and colored people, still pretty much remain on the same trajectory as they were a long time ago. There was an improvement, but by in no means has it improved. Some of those systematic things around migrant labor are still in place, if you think about it to a large extent. So in a way, you could argue that even though we gained our democracy and there was political justice, we certainly haven't gained economic justice. And what's important about that is that the economic justice is part and parcel of health, because we know that poverty, poor health, poverty and poor health are very much linked. Poor health is rooted in political, social, and economic justices. Poverty increases the chances of poor health. Increased income inequality has been associated with higher rates of crime, greater consumer debt, and poor health outcomes. and poor health in turn traps communities in poverty. So you end up with this vicious cycle of poor health and actually remaining in poverty. So at the peak of apartheid, for example, the investment in schools was about 10 times higher for white students compared to black students. Even after 94, even all these progressive policies, as I say, have been put in place, the investment in white kids was still 2.5 times that of urban black kids and 3.5 times of rural blacks. And as we sit right now, we've got this inequity in education where you've got two divides. You've got the 75% that are poor and disenfranchised and 25% that have good quality education. And what's important with that is, as I said, is that it locks people in this vicious cycle of poverty. And for example, if you look at some indicators from health, infant mortality rate per 1,000 births. If you live in the rural areas, your infant mortality rate per 1,000 is 71. If you are urban, is about half that, 43. Similarly, if your mother has a matric, your infant mortality rate is about half of that of a mother who does not have a matric. If you live in the poorest quintile, infant mortality rate is 87 per 1,000 births compared to when you are in the richest quintile, which is 22, you know? And I mean, I can go on. There are so many examples around how you find the expression of poverty that is linked with health outcomes. And what's important also is the intersectionality of all these things. So race is very much important, and that is what we're talking about. But we have to understand that racism and the way in which it impacts on people it kind of impacts itself differentially. So Black women in particular, you find that they kind of experience racism in a very different way, in a very particular way than men, for example. So, for example, just by being women, you know, there's this burden of caring for people. So you find female relatives, Black female relatives are the ones that will care for sick people, sacrifice their education, sacrifice going to work, miss out on opportunities, and also just keep getting locked into poverty and poor health. So I think those are some of the issues that pertain to racism and how it actually expresses itself as a social determinant of health that has started from way back historically and is still expressing itself to this day.
Thank you for that, Dr. Naledi. Just a quick question. Where do you think we can begin to make some meaningful changes to improve the healthcare system in our society?
Lance, do you want to start and I'll continue?
Yes, I'm happy to start to speak about. I mean, there are issues of race, I think, can be challenged in at a number of different levels within the health system. And I'll start with kind of the macro level, kind of systemic racism and how to resist some of those. I mean, there are different possibilities for how to think about and reimagine not only the health system, but our socio-political system. Because I think that, like Tracey mentioned earlier about systemic racism as a function of our continuing economic and resource inequalities along racial lines, I think we need to be quite explicit in our policies, in the design of our institutions, and actually reflect on the complex array of kind of anti-Blackness within our institutions that happen at a structural level. And there are various ways in which we can resist and implement, and part of it is actually being quite explicit. I mean, we saw that there were some failures in our system in trying to redress. We also operate in a global economic system that values capitalism, right? That values neoliberalism, that dehumanizes Black people globally, and uses and places Black people in positions of cheap labor. So it's almost, so neoliberalism is almost the lesser kind of dehumanized state of slavery, but yet the slavery is still happening today through cheap labor systems and through these capitalism structures that really perpetuate poor health outcomes, and both physical health outcomes as well as mental health outcomes. So it is important to kind of understand how it is that, what's required for us to actually think about the ways in which racism is reproduced in our economic systems. And I mean, that is a macro policy question about what's needed to be able to really transform our systems. And it is a question of redress. Resources need to radically shift in our country in terms of macro policy to enable poor people to actually be supported or be, and this, I think this is where the conversations of the national health insurance were so important for building solidarity across income lines, to be able to say that actually, instead of the rich consistently getting richer through a capitalist neoliberalist market, let's actually radically think about the intersection or the relationship between being Black and being poor, because there is a relationship between socioeconomic status and race within our country, and to be able to say, actually, how does the rich subsidize the poor? So, and that's an important question. And it's also a question for many Black people who are poor, who are rich within our country, who's wealthy, to be able to understand what their role is in that conversations of redress. But we also know that majority of white people actually are economically quite well off, right? And the wealth is actually distributed in racial lines. And we can see that just by in the Cape Towns, if we just look at Cape Town in itself, just the kind of infrastructure of townships compared to the white suburbs, historically white suburbs, and also seeing who occupies those suburbs. I mean, we still call them white suburbs, colored townships and Black townships, because the occupation of those people still is allocated according to pigmentation. So that's kind of a structural level question, and particularly around economics. I also think that it is important to think about meso-level practices, right? So what are the practices within our institutions that reproduce or perpetuate anti-Black practices? So if we think about our appointment process, if we think about how many students are actually occupying spaces, looking at our exclusion rates, looking at how to support students in training who are Black, and what are the issues that Black students are facing during their training, particularly with regards to the cultural aspects of these academic or the institutions of higher education that results in failures or feelings of alienation, exclusion, and not feeling like Black realities are adequately represented. It is in research institutions. It's also a question about how we reproduce research or produce research that tells only particular or single narratives about Black people, right? Only telling single stories, taking away Black people's agency. There are so many research that is being done that actually completely places Black people in a box when it comes to their livelihoods, making Black people almost, or at least constructing Black people as almost not knowing and not being knowledge holders, and that those knowledge holders are usually, the knowledge producers who are many times white scholars or white researchers who are then doing research on these Black bodies. I mean, it's so important to think about what kinds of frames and lenses do we use when we actually write about Black realities. And I think that's quite important. I think it's also important for us to think about our patients, right? When in service delivery practices, how do we actually disenable or delegitimize patient experiences just because our understanding of a particular experience is limited in the ways that our training has given us the knowledges. It's important to be critical of the knowledges and the kind of practices that has been taught or trained through these institutions. And we need to be able to understand how these practices are limited, and limited especially in the ways that we are responsive to Black people, and Black women in particular, Black queer people. And it's very important that, you know, our interventions understand that people are human and Black people are human beings. And how do we take on a project of humanity in our systems and in our institutions to humanize Black people, right? And to be able to call out within ourselves and within our colleagues the ways in which dehumanizing practices of Black folk happen, right? So it is important to really understand the implications of these structures on our psyches. And so, I mean, there are a number of different strategies and tactics that health workers or students in training can adopt to really think about what are the ways, how do I perform saviorship, for example, with patients by completely taking away their agency and actually like positioning them as not knowing or not being able to understand their disease, and almost infantilizing many of the Black patients. It's also understanding privilege, right? Who do we privilege in our institutions? Who do we, and by privilege, we mean by the systematic or the cultural ways in which our students, or in which our systems and our institutions are set up to normalize cultures and practices of some over others. It's, for example, knowing that, you know, there are so many students, white students in particular, who have access to deans, who have relational capital, where reading books and having conversations about medicine is it's a norm to have dinner table conversations about the academy. And there are many poor and Black students where that reality is completely far removed from how they understand themselves in the institution, and that insider outsider practices are quite important. And so how do we actually enable Black poor students in particular in training to really understand themselves as being part of the system and the institution? So I'll end there and allow Tracey to also name some of the ways in which these changes and strategies for resisting can happen.
So just before that, just want to ask, we can see from history and other social determinants that this is quite a chronic problem globally. Why do you think there's such a slow response to change?
So I think we need to also just go back to some of the things that Lance spoke about when they were talking about implicit racism. Is that I think, you know, part of the problem is that people don't perceive themselves to be racist, you know, because people perceive being racist as, you know, being overt racism, and, you know, I haven't called somebody a K name or etc. You know, we all perceive ourselves to be these good people that are out to do good, but there's a lot of unconscious biases that are inherent that we are not aware of, that express themselves without us knowing, you know. So for example, there have been some studies that have been done where they have looked at how, for example, some white doctors can perceive, will give Black patients less painkillers, so they will give them less painkillers because they perceive that they can tolerate pain more, or they perceive that maybe Black skin can take more pain than white skin and things like that. And those are often unconscious biases that people are not intending to say, I am going to do this because, as I said, it's important to realize that racism, even though it perceives as it being about hate, it's not about hate. It's a system that is there to create something else. It's an economic tool, and the dehumanizing of people that we have, all of us are brought up in the system that dehumanizes people and almost cancels out people's cultures, people's humanities, and advances other races over others. I mean, a perfect example, which Professor Mayosi actually introduced into the faculty many years ago when he did his presentation, when he became a dean, was to talk about, all of us believe that Hippocrates was the father of medicine, but in fact it wasn't. It was Imhotep who was alive many years before Hippocrates and practicing medicine in Egypt before that was, and that's the kind of history that has been almost erased. So when we think about how then do we transform that, and I think as Lance was talking about some policies, and I think I want to mention here at UCT, we've got the UCT transformation strategy in the faculty, which says that we need to do more than just changing the demographics. And I think we've done well in terms of the demographics of our students. But the question is, what about the demographics of our teachers and the professors and things like that? So if we're going to change demographics, we need to change it all the way through, such that if I'm a student, like Lance was saying, that social capital that you have of seeing people that look like you, people that you can interact with, that all of us have that. It's not only a privilege that is provided to students that are white. Students that are of different races can actually see people that look like them also in the academic body. It's about not just, because also as it's not just about the demographics that I'm Black, and as Lance kept on saying, that this is a system that all of us need to, there are many things that we need to unlearn, and a lot of those things are actually in our subconscious. So the curriculum, what we teach, how we teach it, and who teaches it, and what kind of knowledge systems we center in that curricula is also important. And the environment that we do that in, the places and the spaces, the cultural, the symbols, the art, the identity of the institution. What does it look like? When I sit in an institution and I'm surrounded by whiteness, does that make me feel comfortable or not? I mean, many people, if you talk to Black students and Black staff, sometimes when they walk into spaces, they automatically get hives, because it's an alienating and an exclusive environment. And one of the other issues that Lance spoke about was anchoring in community. That it's not just kind of going out there and being the saviors with the paternalistic approach to say, we know what we do, we're going to save you, this savior complex. It's around working with people and understanding that they have agency. They are the ones that are dealing with these problems. They understand these problems, and actually they know how to solve their problems. You just need to support them and work with them from where they are. So it's not about, when you say anchoring in communities, about working with communities and actually making sure that you are actually supporting them and partnering with them, and not necessarily just doing things for them. So I think all of these things, in the way in which we learn, in the way in which we do research, in the way in which we provide service delivery, to me, it's calling on us at an individual level to do our own work of understanding some of these systems and unlearning things that we've learned. So there's definitely individual work that needs to happen. But as Lance said, there is also the meso and macro work that needs to happen, because this is a system. This is a system, and all of us need to be conscious and be awake and be able to make sure that we are, in as much as this system has developed over hundreds of years, it is going to be a system that is going to take us a long time to unravel. But I think the change starts with us as individuals.
And just on that, do you think that this year with George Floyd and with people engaging more in the Black Lives Matter movement, has there been progress?
I think that, I mean, progress for who and progress for what? I think that's quite important to think about. And there are so many, I think, just to take it a little step back, right? So George Floyd is Black American, and we know the incidents around police brutality, but we also know the American context, right? And we understand the ways in which Black bodies are treated within the American context. In South Africa, there are so many Black lives that don't even get the media or the airtime that George Floyd has gotten. And that's not a conversation to say that, it's not a critique to say that, there shouldn't be momentum around George Floyd's death. It's saying that there are so many George Floyds who are dying not only at the hands of police brutality, but structural systems. I mean, the extent of gender-based violence, the amount of Black women who are killed in South Africa. I mean, it's a public health emergency. The urgency no one's talking about, or the airtime that we get around and naming the Black and queer bodies, Black lesbian women who are brutally raped and brutally murdered. And so it is important for us to reflect and think about, what do we mean by progress? I do think that there was definitely progress around solidarity across the globe, particularly with our American siblings, our Black American siblings and our African American siblings. I think, and cross solidarity is so important in the fight for the fight against anti-Black racism, because I do think that we are connected in the ways in which Eurocentrism and Western hegemony actually not only dehumanizes Black people, but literally kills Black people. I mean, George Floyd, I can't breathe, and the I can't breathe movement happens and we could see with our context, with what happened in 2015, 2016, and a lot of the kind of protests in other institutions. But if I only focus on UCT's momentum around Black students coming forward and saying that they can't breathe because the system excludes them. The system literally kills them because of the rates of suicide and mental health issues that we see by Black students. So the system, systems of higher education, systems within South Africa, Black people are struggling. And one example is also with COVID. If I may reference the City of Cape Town's intervention, that's so pertinent to show the ways in which anti-Black racism happens, and also the importance of intersectional approaches or intersectionality as an approach. Is what happened with the Strandfontein intervention, which was the city's idea of kind of, mopping up the system. So getting poor Black people who are, that don't have homes, that are street-based, because many of them consider the streets their home, who are street-based and taken into the space where completely many of them are immunocompromised, and having to then go into a space where there are so many infection control policies weren't addressed. There was a whole lot of issues. There were reports of gender-based violence at various levels. So I mean, the ways in which Black bodies and Black poor bodies in particular, we saw the video and all the horrific and horrendous with the current occupations around land, and how houses have been, people's homes, shacks have been demolished as people are taking a bath. The city is breaking down people's homes, police are breaking down people's homes, and people are running naked in the streets. I mean, completely dehumanizing. And I'm mentioning this because what I'm saying is that the struggle against anti-Black racism needs to be taken seriously. And because Black people are dying, Black people can't breathe, and we need to mobilize, we need to build momentum, we need to use the opportunities like Black Lives Matter to be able to put this on the agenda. And I'm so happy and grateful for SHAWCO Health and the partnering student organizations that have taken this to build that momentum around mobilizing students, around thinking together, having conversation. But it's so important for us to connect our struggles and build solidarity across different spaces. But it's not only George Floyd. There are many people. There's Robin Matsumi. There are sex workers who are dying and we don't know their names. And we need to start knowing their names. We need to know who are the Black people, who are the Black bodies who are killed by the system in our contexts.
So you're so right, Lance. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that, we are connected to one another, regardless of who you are in terms of your income levels, where you live, whether you are global north, global south, wherever you are. I mean, the coronavirus does not distinguish any of that. And the world has come into the stark realization that we are truly, truly connected. But unfortunately, our lives, as Lance is referring to, are not valued in the same way, in terms of also who goes out and exposes themselves to risk. It's usually poor Black bodies that are the ones that are essential workers that have to go and man the supermarkets for us to have food and go to the farms so that we can have food and things like that, Whereas the top 1% that we've been talking about, that are the beneficiaries of racism, actually, and the capitalist system. The beneficiaries are sitting in their lovely homes behind screens and are working online, and they have the resources to be able to do that in their comfortable homes, where they can have a laptop and Wi-Fi and data and all of that. And you can see that also in the student body, and how some students have really struggled with remote learning and things like that. So I think COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter have actually amplified things that activists have been talking about for a very long time. And I agree with Lance that I think what has happened is that the amplification of that voice is global. I mean, I was blown over when on the Lancet, there was actually a paper that was talking about Black Lives Matter. I think even though, as Lance says, is that we have a long way to go, but there are some the fact that the whole Black Lives Matter has amplified the voice, is mainstreaming this conversation. The fact that we are having this conversation right now, and I think our challenge is about, firstly, how we amplify the conversation. I mean, let's talk about UCT, because this is where we are, how we amplify this conversation amongst our student body and amongst ourselves as the community of UCT. And importantly, so what? What are we going to do about that? Now that we have educated ourselves, now that we are more aware, now that we are awake, how are we going to be different? How are we going to create a UCT that is different, a UCT that is centered in people, in communities, and does not have this high and mighty attitude that we are UCT, we will come and save you and do things for you. How do we actually start to listen more to people and actually use our resources to amplify their needs and the things that matter to them? So it's really around thinking very differently about how we do our work, how we learn, how we teach, and how we provide services to people as well. And I think it's exciting. Because I think, as everybody's saying about COVID-19, is that we need to build better. When we come back from COVID-19, it has to be a different world. And I think the notion of how we are in terms of in terms of race and racism and how it expresses ourselves in our practices as the health sector is quite important. And I think that's going to be a critical pillar in terms of building back better. That has to change. But as Lance said, it's not just about UCT. It has to be contextualized within our society, within our country, and more broadly within the global context.
Thank you, Dr. Naledi. I just want to maybe circle back to healthcare. And I'm asking this from a public health perspective. What can we do and what can public health leaders do to address these different issues?
I think we've kind of touched on that, and I think Lance gave a very nice framework about different levels around which we can intervene at the macro level, at the meso level, and at the individual level. But for me, everything starts with conversation. And I think we need to have these conversations. It must be conversations that we have like this in terms of podcasts collectively, but it's also conversations that we must have over the dinner table. And we must also learn the language. We must also learn the language because you can't express yourself when you actually don't learn the language. So my wish is that this kind of conversation can be a conversation that is not a conversation that we fear. That is a conversation that we gravitate towards, in the conversation where we actually show our vulnerability and our openness to be able to learn and come at this conversation. And I think particularly for those that do have the privilege to actually come to this conversation with humility and understand that actually we need to be able to listen to other people's experiences and be able to hear them and amplify their voice and let them be the guide around how it is that we transform. So, and as I said, it's in the institution, it's also about who teaches, how we teach, the environment in which we teach, what we teach, and also being very much embedded in communities, as I said. And I think those are some of the things that we can do as particularly in terms of us as a faculty here at UCT. Lance, would you like to add?
Yes, thanks for that, Trace, and I completely agree with that. And maybe just to add, I think it is important for us to think about ourselves as political beings, our practices in the work, as health practitioners, as academics, as people who are as scholars, as researchers doing the work. And it's important for us to understand that our work is political. And our acts, our doing, our practices are political acts, because in every relationship, there are power asymmetries. And so it is important for us to reflect on the ways in which, how we are positioned within these systems and structures, and how these structures and systems, historically and contemporary, have produced our realities. And so it is so important for us to become conscious about our own positionalities. That means, our own privileges, understanding, how our race, our gender, our sexuality lies on these different continuums of marginality, whether we have access to the centers of power or we don't. And so it is so important for us in our resistance project to be able to understand these structures, to understand power, to understand politics, the political nature of our work. And so to also be, to be quite intentional about the limitations of our practice, our biases, but also be quite intentional about what our assets are. What do we have at our disposal that gives us access to making a difference in our practices? What's our proximity to patients' experiences? I mean, I always say I come from a township community. I was born and bred in a township community. And there's specific, although I have emerged into this idea of a middle class kind of being, because I'm currently doing my PhD and I have to sit, I've emerged in classes, I still understand the realities of a working class home. I understand, and that gives me proximity to understand colored people, colored experiences, and the understanding of a working class community. And so that I have at my disposal. And so, but it's still important for me to reflect on my limitations, to reflect on my new reality, my emerged reality, but still be able to understand that actually my practice needs to not reproduce the systems that will automatically make me dismiss where I come from and who I am, and to delegitimize the people that represent who I am. And so it is so important for us to constantly reflect on our relatability, our acceptability, and also understand the marginality of the people that we engage with. But I do think an awareness of systems, and then the importance of what Tracey said, but about the understanding, building the language to understand your critique, to locate your critique, to critique yourself, because it is a personal project as much as it is a political project, because to me, the personal is political. So it is important for us to understand that we are located, and it's in our everyday practices that we resist anti-Black racism. It's the conversations that we have at the dinner table. It's the understanding of when we work in groups, who takes up most space, who takes up most voice, whose ideas are always being legitimized, who is always silenced, who are the people that we constantly construct as not knowing, or that their ideas don't matter, or that their contribution isn't valid, right? Who are the patients that we think are deserving of our humility, of our work, of us going beyond what we expected to do? Those are the kinds of questions that we need to be thinking about. And like Tracey said, undoing and unlearning a lot of our biases, a lot of our stereotypes, and to be able to also be quite explicit about the systems that we've been trained in our critique of those systems, because those systems exist within us. Anti-Black racism exists within us. And I think if you locate it in South Africa, it's very difficult to make the argument that it doesn't, because we carry such an anti-Black racist history. And so we need to be able to understand that actually within our training, within our systems, within our institutions, it's important for us to recognize when those practices that we've been trained in, when the examples that we've been giving, when the cases, the ways in which our cases have been constructed, it actually reinforces these stereotypes and these biases that we have. I also think most importantly that, you know, understanding racism is about centering the realities of Black people and centering the realities of African people, Black African people. And so, and that doesn't mean that white people are excluded from the conversation. It just means, and it doesn't mean that that it's a movement for building, for anti-whiteness, to say that we are against whiteness, or white people at least. But we are against a system that have constructed white people as the only people that we can draw from, that have built knowledge, that have created science, that are the only people who are legitimized in the ways in our teaching. So and those are, and we need to be quite frank about how our institutions do that and how we do that, because we are people and we reproduce this. These institutions. I think a final thing, and I do think that this is quite important in the process of unlearning, is that we should be able to, you know, as Black people, be quite aware of the terrible role played by these institutions, our education institutions, our health institutions, our religious institutions, in creating a false understanding of ourselves as Black people. And I think that's quite important, that we need to be able to reclaim our agency as Black people, to be able to say that actually we are authors, we are the authorities of our lives. And we need to facilitate a process of reclaiming and legitimizing African realities and African people. And that we should understand how healing practitioners as not just being a medical doctor, that healing practitioners is a wide range of people, and medical doctors are one element or one aspect of creating healing. And it's a central part, but a traditional healer is equally important. An African traditional healer is equally important, and the role is equally important in communities. And so as a health practitioner, you are a facilitator of social change. Your practice as a health practitioner is a political act. And so I'll end there.
Thank you, Lance. I think we're running out of time a little bit as well. So I just want to finish off with one last question from my side. In public health, we've been taught over again that we need to start looking for these issues and start the conversations as students. But I just want to ask you, what can be done to empower and encourage students, especially in the health sciences, to develop their role as advocates?
Go ahead, Lance.
I feel like I spoke so much, Tracey, but just to address your question, Z, I think that it's so important that, and like I said earlier, the advocacy is within the system. You know, all of us can within our roles, and sometimes it is difficult. It's very difficult to advocate in a system that is so that is fundamentally it's very difficult to change, right?
Yeah.
The people that have been there before, the ways in which things are understood, the way things work, it's very difficult to change it. But I do think, you know, mobilizing and I think a conscientization project is important, building a sense of consciousness about what it is that you are resisting. And I think the roads must fall, fees must fall, group of students and the occupation in the deanery of that time was such a beautiful way of understanding how Black students have mobilized within the institution to actually say there's something that is just not right. And there was a burning in their bellies to be able to say that we want to reimagine a system and an institution that is actually, that understands Black people, that understands that when we walk the halls of this space, of these hospitals, of the institutional trainings, that Hamilton Naki and all these different people, you know, that their lives, in our histories, that their lives are being celebrated, that their contributions are being honored, and that they are not erased from the knowledge production project like they have been previously. And so it is finding the you know, that burning belly, that burning in your belly, to be able to mobilize, to find connections, but also to be quite brave. And Tracey mentioned it earlier, to be able to be brave in our vulnerability when we have these conversations, to be able to caucus, and when something is not okay, to talk about it, to not be afraid of the system, right? There are so many. I think we live in a time where we need to claim our agency and take up space as Black people, to be able to say, I am not okay with these practices, right? And I do not think that this is okay. And to be able to understand that if the system does not have mechanisms for you to come forward, then there's something inherently wrong with the system if you want to take your issue forward and advocate for that issue. There's inherently wrong with something with the system, and you need to find the channels within the system to be able to work, to actually insert resistance into the system. And we know that I mean, I'm just using the the occupation of the 2016 cohort of Black students who occupied the Dean's Suite, to really think about that moment in which there are so many progress, there's so many institutional mechanisms that have now been implemented into the system because of a very difficult, contentious time within the faculty. And I can only applaud those students for being brave, for not accepting the status quo, and to be able to say that we have the agency to make a difference and we want to be able to do this in this particular way. And this is what we expect from the system. And we don't care what it takes, but it needs to happen.
Dr. Naledi, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I agree completely with Lance, and I think it's about also holding those in power accountable. I mean, in the university, the faculty, and also in the country more broadly, because oftentimes in South Africa, we have these policies that say all the right things, but when it comes to implementation, then things fall through the cracks, you know. So I think as students in particular, when we're talking about advocacy, advocacy is also about understanding the situation. So, you know, and I think the students, as Lance has been saying, have actually shown themselves that this is something that you know how to do. I mean, you were able to advocate for a reduction in fees. You were able to advocate for a change and a transformation in the university and in the faculty in many ways. And I think also the one other thing that I really like about what Lance was saying was about reflection. So it's both about individual reflection and creating spaces, safe spaces where we can reflect, because even though sometimes we can reflect on our own practices, as we said earlier on, there's a lot of implicit kind of unconscious biases that we may not be aware of. So you need people who can call you in and kind of open your eyes to some of these things. So, I mean, I think I just want to add the notion of we also need to also work from a basis of knowing exactly what the issues are, knowing exactly what the facts are, being able to use the evidence as we have identified here, that there is actually tangible evidence that shows that racism and the impact of racism definitely, and I think Lance put it very nicely, that it's not just about impacting on health, it actually also kills people, as we've seen with George Floyd and others. And I think it's important that we make sure that we have facts that we can prove, we can hold people accountable, and we actually want to see change. And that change must be visible. We must be able to actually measure it and monitor it. And it's not just about numbers, like we have X number of students, it's about the experience of those Black students in those institutions. And it's about what it is that they're learning and the kinds of practitioners that they become. Are they becoming these kinds of practitioners that we're talking about? So, and I think students have a big role in playing and insisting that the education should actually deliver on those goals and that agenda. Thank you very much, Z.
Thank you, Dr. Naledi. Thank you, Lance. I think we're going to close it off here. Thank you to you both for joining us today and for the incredibly insightful conversation that we had. I think it's such an important discussion for us to have and help us to reflect on how we should be more aware of these issues and how we can enact some meaningful change. Personally, I've learned that the power of conversation on topics such as these, just in this discussion, I've learned so much, and I hope that we, as developing healthcare professionals in our early careers, now are more mindful of these issues so that we can ensure we have some better care and service for our future patients. So on behalf of UCT Surgical Society and SHAWCO Health, we'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us today. And just another reminder about the Google form attached to this podcast, where you can ask any questions or comment on what you've heard so far in the podcast. And to end off, please look out for our second episode of this series coming out next week, where we'll continue this discussion. All the details will be posted on our social media, so please follow us for more information. Thank you for joining us today, and another big thank you to our speakers. Have a great day. Goodbye.